Hey guys, tonight we are slipping back into a world where the smell of bread baking in stone ovens fills the crooked lanes of medieval towns, and the sound of market bells mixes with the chatter of vendors. Picture the dim glow of tallow candles in bakeries, flour dust drifting through shafts of sunlight, and baskets lined with coarse cloth waiting for warm loaves. It feels comforting until you realize, you probably wouldn't survive this. Because in the Middle Ages, if your bread was too small, too light, or too suspicious, it could literally cost you your life. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love it if you commented your location and the local time where you are, so I can see how far this little circle of history lovers stretches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move with the townsfolk through the cobbled streets, the scent of yeast and warm wheat drifting past. Bakers were central figures in medieval communities, almost as important as priests or blacksmiths, for bread was the staple of life. But it was also carefully monitored. Each loaf had to weigh a precise amount. If you shorted a customer, even accidentally, the penalty could be brutal. At first, it might mean fines or being paraded through town with your loaves hung around your neck, rather humiliating. But repeat offenders? Well, some were hanged for light bread. Imagine losing your life because your flour was damp that morning. The law was called the Assize of Bread and Ale, one of the earliest consumer protection laws in Europe. Sounds helpful, doesn't it? But it placed terrifying pressure on bakers. If grain prices rose, the size of the loaf had to shrink, but it still needed to meet exact standards. You picture yourself, hands dusted in flour, nervously weighing each batch as a stern official looms. Slip up, and you might end up in the town pillory or worse. Of course, not all punishments were consistent. Some bakers caught cheating were dragged through the streets tied to a cart. Others were literally tossed into rivers. Historians still argue whether these watery punishments were symbolic washing away dishonesty or just a way of entertaining the crowd on market day. Either way, it was not exactly what you'd call gentle quality control. But there were quirky moments too. Some bakers, to avoid any chance of being accused of fraud, gave what we call today the baker's dozen 13 loaves for the price of 12. It was safer to give a little extra than risk the rope. So the next time you see a dozen bagels, that strange 13th one is a little medieval insurance policy, baked in fear of the gallows. You might imagine the town gossip, huddled by the well, whispering about poor Thomas the baker who underbaked his rye loaves and got us soaking in the mill pond. Someone probably laughed. Someone probably gasped, and everyone silently checked their own pantry bread with new suspicion. After all, in an age without sealed packages or nutrition labels, trust had to be policed with severity. There's a cozy irony here, isn't there? Bread, the most nurturing, homely symbol we know, was also a daily gamble. You wouldn't just nibble a crust by the fire, you'd weigh it, judge it, pray it wouldn't be your undoing. And while you sit now with modern bread machines and grocery stores, the thought of risking death over a slightly underweight loaf feels almost absurd. Still, the Middle Ages remind you that survival hinged on rules that were equal parts practical and bizarre. The hearth fire crackles low in your imagination, the scent of yeast lingering. And as you lean back, you think what other ordinary acts might have been a brush with danger back then. You'll soon see that bread was only the beginning. You wander onward from the warm haze of bread ovens into the bustle of a medieval market square, where the clatter of hooves and the rustle of fabrics mix in the air. Brightly dyed cloth hangs from stalls, scarlet, indigo, and green shimmering in the morning sun. The women finger silks with quiet longing, and men glance warily at merchants selling velvet. It feels festive, almost like a fair, until you recall that one wrong choice of fabric could be enough to ruin you. In the Middle Ages, fashion wasn't just vanity, it was law, and deadly law at that. You picture yourself adjusting your cloak before stepping into the square. If you were something beyond your station, say a commoner daring to sport silk sleeves, you might be fined, humiliated, or even executed. It sounds outrageous, but these sumptuary laws existed to keep society in its neat little hierarchy. The nobility claimed silk and fur for themselves. Rich colors like purple or scarlet belonged only to the very top of the pyramid. You, as a farmer's daughter or cobbler's son, you were expected to wear homespun. Browns and grays, thank you very much. The rules weren't just about pride. They were about control. If everyone looked equal, the lords fretted, how would you know who to bow to in the street? So they drew strict lines in wool and velvet. And the punishments were no laughing matter. There are accounts of people flogged for wearing ermine when they shouldn't, or fined the equivalent of a year's wages for a single illegal gown. You probably wouldn't survive a trip to your modern closet, too many suspiciously noble items hanging there. Of course, the laws varied wildly by region. In England, statutes spelled out which fabrics each class could wear. In Florence, velvet collars were restricted to men of a certain income. And in France, even prostitutes were told what colors to use, yellow, often so their trade could be spotted at a glance. Historians still argue whether these laws were truly enforced with deadly seriousness, or whether they were more often ignored until someone needed to make an example. And yet, humans being humans, people found ways around the rules. Tailors learned to sneak forbidden trims into hems where they wouldn't be noticed. Merchants dyed wool to resemble prissier silks. Some even joked that you could tell who had cheated by the length of their sleeves. After all, if a peasant shows up at church with billowing cuffs, you can bet the local bailiff's eyebrow went up. There were quirky outcomes too. In some towns, the laws created entire fashion police positions inspectors who roamed the streets to peek at hems and sleeves. Imagine someone squinting at your shoelaces today and saying, "Sorry, those belong only to knights." It feels absurd, but in the Middle Ages, appearance was evidence of identity, and to dress above your lot was considered rebellion against the very order of the world. You might find yourself laughing quietly now. Wasn't it easier just to let people wear what they wanted? But the medieval mind lived in a delicate balance of symbols. Purple was power, fur was privilege, and silk was sovereignty. To upset that was to threaten stability itself. As you drift deeper into the square, the bells toll, fabric stalls close, and a cold breeze ruffles your plain wool cloak. You glance at the scarlet tunic hanging nearby and quickly look away. For one fleeting moment, you wonder would you have dared? Or would you have lived quietly in gray, grateful simply to keep your head? The morning market fades behind you, and now you find yourself along a dusty road leading to the village green. The chatter of merchants gives way to the bleating of goats, and the squealing of pigs. A small crowd gathers by a wooden platform, not for a play, but for something stranger, an animal on trial. Yes, in the Middle Ages, creatures could be hauled before a judge and condemned, as if they were guilty of human crimes. You step closer, your sandals brushing the grass, and watch as a bewildered pig is led into the square. Its snout twitches. Nervously while a bailiff reads charges aloud, "This pig did bite a child, to the death." You blink. Surely the animal cannot understand. Yet in medieval law, responsibility stretched even to beasts. Pigs, goats, dogs, even rats might face justice. Punishments ranged from hanging to burning, carried out with full ceremony. It seems absurd, yet here, solemnity cloaks everything. The logic, in its odd way, was about order. If a pig caused chaos, it had disrupted God's harmony. To restore balance, justice had to be seen, even if the accused was covered in bristles instead of chainmail. Sometimes entire flocks were exiled for eating crops that weren't theirs. In one notorious case, rats were summoned to court for stealing grain. When they didn't appear, their lawyers, they had a lawyer argued they couldn't attend because cats made the roads unsafe. Historians still argue whether these trials were sincere attempts at law, or whether they were more like moral theater for frightened villagers. You smile softly at the thought of a rat with a defense attorney, yet behind the humor lies tension. People in the Middle Ages lived close to animals. Pigs shared homes, cats prowled kitchens, horses clattered down streets. When something went wrong, blame needed direction. Rather than shrugging it off, they created rituals of guilt and punishment. It gave people a sense of control in a world where plagues and famine already felt too random. Imagine being the farmer's wife watching her pig dragged away. That animal was more than food, it was wealth, survival, dowry even. To lose it, and in such public disgrace, must have cut deeply. Some records even suggest people wept as their livestock was sentenced, not only for the loss but for the shame of it. Of course, there were quirks of mercy. A donkey once accused of sacrilege having wandered into a church was pardoned because witnesses said it had behaved piously, bowing its head during prayers. You can almost chuckle at that. Salvation through good manners. As you settle into the picture, you realize how unsettling yet strangely comforting these trials were. They reinforced the idea that law touched everything, from crown to creature. Nothing lived outside the order of the medieval cosmos. Even a buzzing fly could, in theory, be accused of spreading corruption. The crowd disperses slowly, their cloaks rustling in the breeze, the platform empty now save for scattered straw. You remain for a moment, the image of the pig lingering in your mind, as if the squeals echo down the centuries. And you think if beasts could face judgment here, what chance would you, with your all-too-human flaws, have had? The fields fade behind you, and the road narrows into a straight path lined with hedges and worn stones. Dust rises from passing carts, and you notice villagers quickly stepping aside, pressing their backs to the brush. A hush falls, and then you hear it, the sound of hoofbeats, steady, deliberate, echoing down the King's Road. The lesson is immediate: you do not stand in the way of a monarch, not here, not ever. In the Middle Ages, blocking the king's passage could be a death sentence. You picture yourself clutching your basket of firewood, heart racing as a mounted guard appears, his banner rippling in the breeze. Everyone bows low, their eyes fixed on the ground. To be in the wrong spot at the wrong moment might mean accusation of disrespect, or worse, treason. The road wasn't just dirt, it was a ribbon of authority. To linger, to argue, even to trip and delay the procession, might mark you as a criminal. The law was practical, of course roads needed to stay clear for armies, royal messengers, and carriages. But wrapped inside that practicality was symbolism. The king's body represented order, and his journey represented destiny. If you obstructed it, you disrupted the whole balance. Historians still argue whether peasants were truly executed for standing in the wrong lane, or if those stories grew taller in the retelling. But fines, floggings, and public humiliation were certainly real enough. And for some unlucky souls, the threat of the gallows hung heavy. You think of the absurdity, tripping over your shoelace as the royal carriage approaches and suddenly being accused of conspiracy. A darkly comic fate, isn't it? One moment you're adjusting your sandal strap, the next you're explaining yourself to a scowling judge. I swear, Your Honor, it was just a knot. Not exactly a defense you'd want to stake your neck on. There are stories of entire villages punished for failing to maintain the king's highways. If mud swallowed a wheel, if bridges collapsed, the blame fell not on chance but on the people. Some were forced to rebuild roads under heavy labor. Others faced steeper costs. It was a reminder, these paths belonged not to the common folk but to the crown, and would betide anyone who forgot it. And yet, quirks softened the edges. In certain festivals, villagers deliberately staged blocking processions, symbolically delaying local lords as a way of expressing communal spirit. These mock blockades, often followed by feasts, hinted at how law could bend into ritual. The line between crime and tradition blurred like chalk washed by rain. You linger on the roadside in your mind, feeling the ground tremble as the royal train passes. The horse's breath clouds in the morning air, banners flutter, and the dust chokes your throat. You bow low, clutching your bundle tightly, grateful you remembered to step aside. Behind you, whispers run through the crowd, half relief, half resentment. And you think, in this world, even standing in the wrong place could end your story before it began. You leave the King's Road behind, your cloak brushing against nettles as you slip back into the quieter lanes of a village. Smoke curls from chimneys, and hens scratch the earth near doorways. Life looks ordinary, but here danger could come not from roads or carriages, but from the way you behaved or misbehaved in the eyes of your neighbors. For in the Middle Ages, odd habits could easily be mistaken for witchcraft, and that mistake could prove fatal. You pause at the sight of an old woman bent over a herb garden. She gathers sage and rue, muttering softly under her breath. Is she simply reciting prayers? Or is it a charm, whispered to the leaves? To you, it's just a grandmotherly act, but to fearful villagers it might look like sorcery. And sorcery was deadly business. In a time when illness spread without warning and crops failed with no clear cause, suspicion filled every gap of understanding. If a cow stopped giving milk, who cursed it? If hail flattened a field, who called down the storm? It was easy to point a finger at the odd neighbor, the widow with cats, the man who kept to himself and stared at the stars. Historians still argue whether accusations of witchcraft were more about superstition or about controlling troublesome villagers. Perhaps both. The laws themselves varied, but they could be frighteningly vague. Malficium evildoing might mean poisoning, or it might mean humming too long while stirring soup. Imagine being accused because you carried garlic tied with string around your neck, a simple word against sickness that looked suspiciously like a spell. Of course, not everyone was condemned. Some herbalists were respected, their knowledge valued. But the line was perilously thin. One wrong word, one unlucky coincidence, and you might be branded dangerous. There's a darkly humorous thought: you sneeze at the wrong moment in church, and suddenly you're suspected of conjuring devils. Bless you never sounded more like a life-saving phrase. Trials could be theatrical. People were asked to recite prayers without stumbling, or to weigh less than expected when placed on scales, both tests for witchcraft. Some were thrown into rivers. If you floated, you were guilty. If you sank, well, let's just say innocence wasn't much comfort. The community wanted certainty, even if it came wrapped in absurd rituals. And yet, whispers of mercy and curiosity existed too. Some villagers sought out cunning folk for blessings, love charms, or healing. To those who needed hope, the same odd habits condemned as sorcery in one town could be honored in another. A candle lit for a safe childbirth might look like witchcraft to one neighbor, but to another, it was a sacred act of care. You picture yourself walking past that herb garden, careful not to meet the old woman's eyes. The wind stirs her hair, the scent of thyme and lavender drifts past, and you can't help but feel a shiver. Not of fear exactly, but of awareness that here, in this medieval world, your quirks, your whispers, your smallest rituals could betray you. You keep walking, cloak pulled tight, grateful for your ordinariness, and hoping never to stand out too much in a village that equates different with dangerous. The path wins you back toward the heart of town. Evening shadows stretch long across the cobblestones, and a low bell tolls from the church tower. Its voice is deep, steady, and final. You notice villagers hurrying, doors closing, shutters pulled tight, candles snuffed early. That bell marks curfew. Ignore it, and you would quickly find yourself in peril, for in the Middle Ages, the night was not yours to wander. You pause at the edge of the square, imagining yourself fumbling with a basket of onions, debating whether to linger. The sound of the bell echoes again, and already guards begin to patrol, carrying torches. To be caught outside after curfew without permission could mean punishment, at first a fine, then stocks, and in some cases, death for repeat offenders. It wasn't just inconvenience, it was survival. Authorities feared fire, theft, or secret plots brewing in the darkness. The word itself, curfew, comes from the French couvre-feu cover fire. When the bell rang, households were required not only to be indoors but to extinguish their flames. You picture yourself bending over a hearth, carefully smothering embers beneath ash, the room filling with the scent of smoke and soot. No wandering sparks meant fewer catastrophic fires in timber-built towns. Practical, yes, but also suffocating. Historians still argue whether curfew bells were rigidly enforced everywhere, or whether smaller villages simply used them as nightly reminders. In some towns, locals joked about it, calling it the sleep bell, but in larger cities, watchmen had orders to crack down. You wouldn't want to test their patience. Imagine being caught outside simply because you dropped your shoe in the mud tree, explaining that to a stern bailiff with a torch. There were quirks, of course. Some festivals lifted curfew for dancing and feasting. Wedding nights might carry exemptions. And in a few places, monks rang double bells, one to warn and one to fine lies, giving townsfolk a last chance to dash inside. Picture people running like startled chickens as the second bell boomed. It must have been both comical and tense. You feel a quiet unease settle as the torches pass, their light flickering against walls. The town is hushed now, doors bared, streets empty. Even dogs seem to slink away. You realize how heavy the night feels when it is forbidden. Your own freedom seems fragile, bound to the rhythm of bells. And you can't help but think tonight, in this medieval world, the difference between warmth by the hearth and danger in the street is only the swing of a clapper in a tower high above. You wake to mist lifting off the river, a pale ribbon threading through meadows and mills. After last night's bell drove you indoors, the water feels like freedom, but even here the rules run deep. Nets hang from willow branches like ghostly laundry, boats bump softly against stakes, and the mill wheel clacks like a lazy metronome. It looks peaceful enough until you learn that taking the wrong fish at the wrong time can drag you into court and, in the worst corners of the realm, toward a punishment you'd rather not test. You step onto a creaking jetty. The air smells of damp rope and crushed mint along the bank. A fisherman checks his mesh with a sliver of bone too narrow and he'll be accused of taking young fry, too wide, and the catch slips through like coins through a holy purse. He isn't just protecting the river, he's protecting himself. Royal and monastic fisheries guard their waters with a jealous eye, and poaching there isn't a little nibble for spirits theft from crown or church. Repeat it, and the penalties darken. You suddenly picture a bailiff with a ledger that has more teeth than the pike you were hoping to fry. Here's sure footing. In England, the king claims whales and sturgeon as royal fish. If a stranded giant washes ashore near your village, you do not carve stakes, you bow to bureaucracy as officials arrive with measuring rods and very serious faces. Another sturdy fact, Magna Carta orders fish weirs removed from the Thames and Medway to keep channels open for traffic. Rivers are roads, remember the kings rode earlier. And traps that block boats block the business of a kingdom. It's funny, in a gentle way, remove the nets here, tighten the nets there. Regulation is the water's version of the assize of bread, just wetter and far more slippery. Not all water is equal. Some stretches are several fisheries, privately held by lords, abbés, or towns. Others are common, though common is not the same as carefree. The year divides into open and close seasons. Certain species, especially salmon, win special protection during spawning. A river bailiff with a measuring rod may wander the bank, checking meshes the way the elataster checks your pint. Yes, even the river has its own fashion police, only this time the cuffs are made of rope. If you're clever, you carry a little gauge to prove your net won't scope up infants of the stream. If you're wise, you also carry a smile for the steward who pretends he invented the law this morning. Quirks ripple along the banks. Rents are often paid in eels. The Domesday Book tallies thousands upon thousands owed to lords and monasteries. You can almost see the reeve turning up at the manor with a barrel that twitches and hisses, muttering apologies every time an escape artist slithers out to inspect his shoes. Monasteries keep carp in carefully engineered ponds, as precious as manuscripts, and novices learn to patch sluices before they learn to patch habits. On fasting days, fish is salvation. On audit days, fish is currency. On feast days, fish is both, plus a lesson in how far a cook can stretch a sauce. Punishments shadow the margins. Cast a hook into the abbot's exclusive bend or set a nightline in a royal preserve and you may be fined into hunger, flogged, or marched to the pillory with a net hung round your neck like an itchy hallow. In some places, chronic poachers slip from the realm of nuisance into felon, and felons meet endings we will not describe at bedtime. Historians still argue whether death for simple fishing offenses was common practice or a theatrical threat meant to scare a hungry community into good behavior. Either way, you decide that turnips taste delicious when compared to arguing with a steward about jurisdiction lines painted by nobody on water that refuses to hold a straight edge. Kneeling at the bank, you cup the chill in your palm and watch the current carry straw and sunflecks past. A boy nearby practices tickling trout, teasing his fingers under a root until the fish shivers and stills. It's a secret, silly skill, and you can't help smiling. But if the wrong steward sees him, his afternoon becomes a seminar on trespass and the meaning of exclusive right. There's always someone to say, that bank belongs to the priory, In this world, even ladder needs a license. The river keeps its own clock. At dawn, eelers slide out in silence. At noon, the miller curses weeds choking the race. At dusk, a watchman strolls with a staff. You think back to the curfew bell and wonder if the water gets a bell too. It does, in its fashion. Saints' days reorganize weirs, floods reset arguments, Solomon runs arrive like processions. Rules bend with seasons and snap back with the first silver flash under a bridge. One spring you're praised for clearing brush to help the flow, the next spring you're fined because someone decides the brush was habitat. If only the fish could fill out forms, they might clarify matters though the otters would still ignore the paperwork. For comic relief, imagine a Lord Steward composing a poem to justify a seizure. Your net was stout, your mesh too small, my patience thin, I take it all. You offer a weak smile and a weaker purse. Even so, mercy glimmers. After bitter winters, some abbeys open their ponds, letting locals draw carp under supervision. Children jiggle at fish leaping in vats. Mothers quietly count meals in their heads. The cellarer pretends not to notice two extra small carp that somehow leap into the same bucket at once. Charity here sounds like a ladle swishing through cold water, and the soft thump of a fish wrapped in rushes for a neighbor. Yet the line between kindness and cruelty stays hair-thin. One village remembers a man forgiven for a single salmon borrowed to feed a fevered wife. Another whispers about someone who lost a hand for cutting weirkards in the night. No gore in this telling, only the chill that prickles when law kisses pity and chooses law. You tuck your fingers deeper into your sleeves and promise yourself you'll enjoy more cabbage this Lent. Cabbage never has a closed season, cabbage simply happens. There is etiquette you never expected to learn. If a sturgeon appears, you cheer, and then immediately stop cheering because it does not belong to you. If an otter steals from your creel, you complain to everyone except the otter, who obeys no ordinance and answers only to appetite. If your neighbor insists a run of eels belongs to his grandfather's grandfather by right of a story told by the hearth, you smile, nod, and change the subject to whether an ancient technique for preventing small arguments from turning into large lawsuits. By late morning the mist burns away, and the river gleams like a blade. You see why rules gathered here. Fish mean protein, rent, ritual, water means transport and power. Break the pattern, and you don't just snag a trout, you snag the invisible threads that hold a community together. You lift your gaze along the bend where willow shadows dapple the current, and decide to walk the bank instead of casting a line. It's safer to admire the glimmer than to debate a bailiff about whether a salmon crossed an imaginary boundary you cannot see, and he cannot prove. As you leave, a fisherman calls a cheerful warning, mind the weirs, mind the seasons, mind the steward. You wave back and tuck the lesson beside the one about bread, and the one about bells. Rivers promise freedom. But in the Middle Ages, freedom keeps a ledger. You keep your feet dry, your hands empty, and your head most importantly still attached. You follow the river lane back toward town where the streets braid together like threads on a loom. The market's voice rises, and fallshockers praising peers, a smith beating time on his invol, children chasing a hoop until you remember that here, noise is never just noise. Words have weight. A slip of the tongue can feel heavier than a baker's loaf, and punishment for a phrase tossed carelessly into the air can fall faster than a curfew bell. You keep your voice tucked close, because in the Middle Ages, blasphemy and forbidden talk are not private weather, they're public storms. You drift beneath the shade of the church porch, and picture the court that often convenes there. Ecclesiastical courts handle spiritual offenses, false oaths, profane invocations, insults to saints' names, slander against clergy. A steady fact to plant your feet on. Across much of medieval Europe, those church courts claimed jurisdiction over offenses of the tongue, while secular courts stepped in when speech disturbed the king's peace or stoked rebellion. Between the two, your words are weighed like wheat on the town scales, except nobody hands you a 13th word as a baker's dozen to be say. People swear less here, at least in public. Not because nobody is angry, but because certain names are not toys. To toss God's name into a bargain, or lace a joke with the Virgin's title, is to drag heaven into a street quarrel. A shopkeeper might hush you with 2 quick fingers. A reeve might fine you on the spot. In some places, repeat offenders stand in the porch and confess aloud with a candle in hand, a revolving carousel of embarrassment that nobody wants tickets for. You suspect buttered bread is safer than buttered speeches. Forbidden speech is a cloak that covers many shoulders. Slander can start as a whisper and end as a scaffold, especially if it accuses a neighbor of sorcery or adultery. Heresy, broader still, turns spoken doubt into a threat to the fabric of the realm. Another sturdy fact to tuck beside your prayer book: the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 hardened procedures against heresy, and by the 13th century papal inquisitors traveled to investigate persistent error. Local rulers often cooperated, so a sentence voiced in a tavern could wander, step by uneasy step, into very official rooms. You take note and tuck your opinions where you also keep your coins, out of sight. Yet the borderlands of speech can be oddly festive. Medieval people love play, parody, and licensed misrule. The Feast of Fools, for instance, sometimes turns hierarchy upside down. Lower clergy mimic higher, processions sing with comic twists, and in a few places a donkey's bray punctuates the music to general delight. Historians still argue whether those antics were widespread or mostly local curiosities, and whether magistrates usually tolerated them or frowned as policy. Either way, you glimpse a culture testing the fence without kicking it down a day to low, then a return to careful words. Humor, like water, finds the cracks. Minstrels earn coins with satire, but a biting verse about a local lord can turn silver into summons. You imagine chalking a clever couplet on a tavern door and waking to discover your poem has been reclassified as sedition. There goes your career as the anonymous nightjock. Memo to self, compliments about the ale are safer, and sometimes even true. Tavern talk is a tide, it flows out with laughter and returns at dawn as testimony. Better to let the tide lap at your boots than sweep you into court. Punishments for speech form a patchwork quilt. Fines and public penance appear often, stubborn defiance invites darker outcomes. Some offenders process barefoot to a shrine, others stand through a long service holding a heavy taper until arms itch more from shame than wax. In certain realms, statutes promised death for blasphemy and obstinate heresy, though practice varied widely. Historians still argue whether officials punished casual cursing as a routine drizzle or used a few severe examples like thunderheads visible, ominous, and meant to keep the rest of the sky in line. You choose a forecast of clear, and keep your sentences sunny. Odd little rules nest in guild halls and town statutes. Certain charters ban ribald songs on saints' days, which quietly suggests the neighborhood chorus returns with gust of the morning after. Craft guilds fine members for brawling with holy names on their lips. A few even keep coffers to pay penalties when spirited journeymen forget their manners. You picture a medieval swear Giroque, an ironbound audited once a year by two very serious men who never, ever laugh during the meeting. They save it for after the minutes are signed, naturally. Near the well, a scribe sells tiny slips of parchment short prayers for travel, childbirth, safe harvest. Blessed words, officially sanctioned, are the mirror image of forbidden ones. Speak these and you braid yourself to protection, speak the wrong ones and you unbraid yourself from the town's patience. To outsiders, the difference isn't always obvious. A trader mangles a phrase while bargaining, and a bystander thinks he has mocked a saint. Mispronunciation becomes misdemeanor faster than you can say I meant no offense. You rehearse your vowels like a cautious singer warming up for vespers. And then there are the streets themselves, which carry every rumor like a river carries straw. The well is a quiet courtroom where cases are tried without clerks, the miller's toll too steep, the steward too fussy, the weather too indecisive. You nod in sympathy and decide your safest sentence is silence. You've already learned how the king's road belonged to the crown and the river bends belong to lords, now you see how the very air belongs to the church when sacred names are at stake. It is the same lesson in a different element. Mind the mesh, mind the bell, mind the mouth. A fringe tidbit flutters by like a loose feather. In some towns, officials posted notices at the gates reminding newcomers to avoid certain oaths and festival time mockeries. Whether anyone stopped to read them in the rain is another matter. Another domestic habit. Mothers trace a little cross on a child's lips when he learns his letters, teaching that the mouth should carry care along with sound. You can almost feel the gentleness of that fingertip and the hush that follows. The lesson is softer than law, and sometimes stronger. By afternoon the market thins, and the bells of vespers roll like warm bread across the square. You sit on a bench beneath a niche where a small stone saint watches everything with patient eyes. Someone nearby tells a joke about the Reeves' new hate a miracle of wool, truly laver tumbles out, quick and harmless. Humor is welcomed when it pricks pride without puncturing sanctity. Aim carefully, you think, like casting a net with the right mesh, big enough to spare the small fry, tight enough to keep you out of trouble with the river bailiff of language. Before you rise, you give yourself a bedside rule of thumb: useful here, useful anywhere. If you wouldn't say it in the church porch with the scribe, the reeve, and your grandmother listening, whisper it to the cat instead. Cats tell no tales, though they judge plenty. You leave the square lighter than you arrived, your tongue safely sheathed. And as the sun slips toward the rooftops, you carry another thread for your tapestry. In the Middle Ages, law does not only map roads and rivers, it maps voices, too, tracing the places where silence is a kind of wisdom and speech a kind of oath. The evening rolls in with the smell of roasting meat, and the muffled cheer of voices spilling from a tavern door. You hesitate on the threshold, the signboard swinging above you a painted tankard, creaking in the breeze. Inside, benches scrape, mugs thump, and laughter rises like smoke. It looks inviting, but you remember another medieval truth: all may be cheap, but selling it without a license could cost you dearly. You step into the glow of rushlights, and see the ale taster making his rounds. He is a plump man with a serious expression, his lips perpetually pursed, as though always ready for the next sip. His job is both inviolable and dangerous: taste each brewer's product, judge its strength, its measure, its honesty. Too much water, too weak a brew, too small a pint, any of these can summon fines. And if you dared to open your tavern without his blessing, punishment could escalate beyond coin. Stocks, whippings, even the loss of your livelihood loomed. A solid fact anchors the room: the assize of Brett and Al, first set down in 13th century England, regulated both bakers and brewers. Just as the weight of a loaf could doom a baker, the measure of a mug could doom a publican. Ale was nourishment here, thick with grain and safer than water. To cheat on ale was to cheat the body, the community, the very rhythm of daily life. Historians still argue whether ale tasting was more ceremonial than effective. Did officials truly detect watered brew, or did they simply enjoy the excuse to sample? Some records suggest ale tasters wielded power lightly, others that they ruled with sour authority. Either way, the position reveals a society anxious about fairness in the essentials of survival: bread, fish, ale laws wrapped in ritual and topped with froth. You imagine the comedy of it: a brewer dragged to court because his pint was half an inch short. Picture the judge frowning over a mug, peering to see whether foam counted toward the measure. You can almost hear villagers whispering, "Careful, last week John's head was too big," meaning the froth, not the man. Medieval humor, practical and sly, ran on these tiny loopholes. But it wasn't always small laughter. Unlicensed taverns were threats, places for rumors, plots, dice games, and mischief. A few too many secret inns, and suddenly you had unrest brewing faster than the ale. So laws bore sharp teeth. In some towns, alewives found guilty of fraud were paraded with their barrels smashed, all streaming down the street like an amber warning. It was messy, sticky, and humiliating. Death sentences for all crimes were rare, but whispers suggest that chronic offenders risked harsher ends, especially when fraud mingled with rebellion. And yet, taverns remained hearts of the community. Weddings ended here, guilds met here, news traveled here faster than in any church porch. Even clergy sometimes sipped, though always with caution. Quirky tidbit: some towns had scolds, brittles, or iron gags used on women accused of gossiping too freely in taverns. A brutal device, yes, but a telling one, showing how the line between convivial chatter and dangerous speech blurred over mugs of ale. You settle at a bench with a wooden cup, the brew nutty and warm, foam clinging to your lip. Around you, dice clatter, songs rise, and the world feels gentler for a moment. You imagine yourself laughing softly at the ale taster's sullen face as he dips his ladle again. In the glow, the lesson glimmers clear: in the Middle Ages, even comfort came measured, tested, judged. You sip carefully, thankful your pint passes muster for tonight, at least. The tavern's ladder fades as you step into the chill of the night air. Stars prick the sky like pinholes in a velvet curtain, and an owl stirs from the rafters of a nearby barn. You follow a narrow path out of town, past hedges and fields, until it opens into the silent edge of a forest. The trees crowd close, their shadows deep and secret. Somewhere within, a stag stirs, and the sound alone reminds you of another perilous truth: hunting the king's deer was not just poaching it, was treason. You pause at the tree line, your cloak drawn tight. Forest law in the Middle Ages was its own fierce kingdom. The royal forest was not simply woodland but a vast swath of land claimed by the crown, often including villages, fields, even entire counties. To cut wood here without permission, to graze pigs, or most seriously, to hunt game reserved for the monarch, was to risk everything. Punishments for poaching ranged from blinding and mutilation to hanging. Historians still argue whether kings enforced these laws with brutal consistency or whether chroniclers exaggerated the terror to glorify royal authority. Either way, you wouldn't risk loosening an arrow tonight. The reasoning was twofold: venison was considered noble fare, meant for feasts of lords and kings, and the forests themselves served as playgrounds for royal hunts. To touch the deer was to touch the crown's dignity. A starving peasant with an empty pot might look at a fat duh and see survival. The law looked at the same animal and saw an insult to majesty. Two visions clashed, and usually the peasant lost. Of course, people found sly ways around the rules. Traps hidden beneath leaves, arrows fletched with dark feathers to vanish in the dusk, even snares shaped to resemble twisted branches. Entire songs and ballads grew up around outlaw heroes, most famously Robin Hood, who thumbed their noses at forest law and lived, at least in story, to laugh about it. You can almost hear the whispered joke: if the deer belonged to the king, why did it graze on my cabbages? There were moments of comic relief, too. One tale tells of a man who dragged home venison disguised as firewood, antlers sticking comically from under the bundle. Another speaks of villagers caught roasting a deer and claiming it had wandered into the pot of its own accord. Judges rarely found these excuses charming. Still, the creativity shows how ordinary folk tried to wriggle through the cracks of harsh law. And yet, there was balance. In some forests, locals held rites of pannage, feeding pigs on acorns or over collecting firewood. These privileges kept resentment just low enough to avoid rebellion. A quirky tidbit: monks in certain abbeys were granted special rights to keep hounds and hunt limited game, their black habits trailing like shadows through the underbrush. The boundary between sacred and secular blurred in the forest, just as it had in the tavern. You take a cautious step deeper, the leaves crunching underfoot. Moonlight silvers the bark, and for a heartbeat, you imagine drawing a bowstring. But the thought alone makes your chest tighten. Better to admire than to risk. The law here is heavy, silent, and everywhere woven into branches, stamped into moss, hidden in the eyes of watchmen who might be listening even now. So you turn back toward the village lights, empty-handed but wiser. In the Middle Ages, hunger and authority often locked horns like stags in rut, and the crown almost always won. Your stomach may grumble, but your head stays safely upon your shoulders. And that, in this dark wood, feels like the greatest feast of all. You return from the edge of the forest, relieved to see the glow of hearths ahead. The village settles into a quieter rhythm, cows lowing in byres, the faint smell of hay, and shutters closed against the night. You pause at the churchyard gate, where carved stone angels lean patiently over graves. Weddings, baptisms, funerals, this ground holds all of them. Yet here too, law could intrude with a sharp edge. Marriage, so tender in storybooks, could become perilous in the Middle Ages if you chose the wrong partner, or even love too closely within your own family. You step into the nave in your mind, where rushes crackle underfoot and candles flicker against beams. Marriage law was not only about affection but about alliances, inheritance, and the Church's definition of holiness. A sturdy fact to rest upon, by the 12th century, the Catholic Church had claimed nearly exclusive authority over marriage in Europe, defining it as a sacrament. That meant breaking its rules was not just scandal, it was sin with legal teeth. The rules stretched wider than you might expect. You could not marry within 7 degrees of kinship, a calculation so broad it included people you'd barely call cousins. Many unions were declared invalid when someone dug into family trees and found a forgotten link. Imagine standing at the altar only to hear, "Sorry, you share a great-great-great-great-grandparent, this marriage is forbidden." Historians still argue whether these restrictions were genuinely enforced in villages or more often used by powerful families as excuses to annul awkward unions. And marriage without permission could be equally risky. Lords claimed the right to approve matches among their serfs, worried about property and productivity. If you eloped, you not only angered your family but risked the wrath of your landlord. In some regions, disobedient couples faced heavy fines or public penance. Whispers even tell of executions for persistent defiance, though such cases were rare and shrouded in cautionary exaggeration. You picture the absurd company of it, 2 young lovers hiding behind a hayrick, whispering vows, only to be discovered by a priest's assistant counting sheep nearby. Or a village gossiper racing to the manor to announce, they've tied the knot without the bishop's blessing. You can almost hear the collective sigh as yet another scandal sets tongues widening by the well. Odd marriage restrictions abounded. In some towns, YOs needed special licenses to remarry, lest their dowry or children's inheritance be compromised. In others, clerics inspected whether couples had consummated the union, an intrusion that feels both serious and faintly ridiculous. Quirky tidbit, certain folk believed if a wedding wasn't blessed on the right feast day, the marriage risked bad luck or worse, accusations of sacrilege. Imagine rescheduling your vows because they fell too close to Lent, only to discover your cousin counts as forbidden kin anyway. Yet marriage could also shield. A runaway serf who wed in a different parish might secure a new identity, the union offering a fragile kind of protection. Some lords turned a blind eye to inconvenient unions when dowries or alliances outweighed the law. And villagers, pragmatic as ever, often focused less on kin and law and more on whether the bride brought a strong cow and the groom a sharp plow. As you sit quietly in the pew, you realize marriage in the Middle Ages was less about romance than about weaving yourself safely into society's net. Choose wrongly, and the net turned into a snare. Choose cautiously, and you might gain not only a partner but a measure of security in a world full of precarious rules. You rise, the candlelight soft on your hands, and step back into the cool night, grateful that your heart can beat freely without the scrutiny of bishops and bailiffs hanging over every vow. The night deepens, and your footsteps carry you onto a muddy street that twists between cottages. Lamps flicker dimly, throwing thin halos on doorways. You glance down and notice something odd: shoes left neatly by thresholds, their leather glistening with grace. In the Middle Ages, even footwear could draw the watchful eye of the law, and sometimes, in the strangest ways, get you into real trouble. Shoes, simple as they seem, were woven tightly into questions of class and propriety. A solid fact to steady yourself: by the late 14th century, Europe had developed a craze for long-toed shoes called polaines. Nobles strutted with tips, so long they had to be tied to their knees with ribbons. Common folk, they were warned off them. Statutes in England, France, and elsewhere restricted toe lengths by rank: 6 inches for knights, 12 for princes, none at all for peasants. Violate the rule, and you might face fines or, in rare cases, worse. The shoe literally measured your place in the social ladder. You chuckle imagining a bailiff kneeling with a ruler in the mud, measuring your shoes as you squirm. Historians still argue whether punishments for polaines were deadly serious or mostly symbolic, but the fact remains, your fashion sense could place your head at risk. And shoes weren't the only culprits. Certain towns forbade wearing shoes inside churches to protect holy floors, and ignoring that could mark you as irreverent. In some places, even walking barefoot at the wrong hour looked suspiciously like penance avoided or witchcraft practice. There's humor in it too. Picture a cobbler dragged into court because he sold noble shoes to a plowman, defending himself by insisting the toes curled naturally. Or imagine tripping on your extravagant points during mass, sending a candle tumbling, and suddenly finding yourself accused of both pride and sacrilege in one disastrous stumble. It's enough to make you appreciate a sturdy, blunt shoe. Quirky tidbit: in certain festivals, villagers mocked authority by wearing shoes backward or mismatched, a playful jab at rules that took themselves too seriously. Such antics often passed as tolerated mischief, but now and then officials cracked down, worried that a joke could turn into defiance. You find yourself glancing at your own feet in the story world. Are your shoes too fine? Too plain? Are they tied properly, respectable enough to avoid suspicion? In a place where every detail of appearance could be judged, even soles and stitching carried weight. And you remember how fashion had already proven dangerous with fabrics and colors. Shoes simply extend that same lesson downward. The wind stirs as you leave the street behind, boots crunching on gravel. You walk carefully now, every step a reminder. In the Middle Ages, even the ground beneath you came with rules. One wrong shoe in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the path might end much sooner than you wished. Morning light spills across the rooftops as you wander back toward the bustling market square. The air is sharp with the scent of leather, tanned hides displayed in neat stacks, and bolts of fabric draped like banners in the wind. Merchants call out prices, a fiddler plays a jaunty tune, and children weave between stalls with sticky fingers from money cakes. It feels lively, harmless, almost festive. But here too, danger lurks in what you wear. The medieval sumptuary laws stretched beyond color and fabric. They reached into silk, swords, and any item that might make you look wealthier or more dangerous than you were allowed to be. You brush past a merchant selling gleaming shears of silk. The fabric is smooth, luminous, sliding like water over your fingers. A solid fact: by the 14th century, English and French statutes spelled out which classes could wear silk, velvet, and ermine. To flaunt these without entitlement could mean crushing fines or, in repeat cases, punishment harsh enough to scare you off forever. Clothes weren't just fashion. They were politics stitched into every seam. And swords. Those two were tightly controlled. Carrying a blade without status was an invitation to suspicion. A cobbler with a sword looked less like a craftsman, and more like a threat. Even knives were sometimes regulated, especially in cities, where violence could flare as quickly as spilled ale. To carry the wrong weapon in the wrong place might mark you as a rebel or worse, a traitor. Historians still argue whether death was common for such infractions or if dramatic tales of hangings were cautionary exaggerations. But punishments severe enough to ruin lives were real. You smile faintly at the coming of it. A tailor hauled before court because his wife's gown had sleeves wider than permitted, or a butcher fined because he wore a belt studded with brass beyond his rank. Imagine someone today being told, "I'm sorry, that handbag is treason." It's ridiculous. Yet in the Middle Ages, clothing was law. You wore on your skin. Quirky tidbit: in Florence, officials once measured sleeves with wooden rods to ensure they weren't too extravagant. Elsewhere, towns appointed wardens of apparel, who walked the streets checking fabrics, trims, and jewelry. Think of them as fashion police, only with real authority. One wonders if they secretly envied the very clothes they forbade. The deeper truth is that society feared blur. If a farmer could pass for a knight with a velvet cloak and a long sword, then order does all. Appearance was the shorthand for hierarchy, the visual script everyone read at a glance. Disturb that script, and chaos seemed close. So the laws, however odd, stitched people back into their places. As you pass a stall selling simple wool, you tug your cloak tighter and step away from the silk, away from the tempting shimmer of what is not yours. Better plain cloth than dangerous fiery. In this world, the wrong thread could unravel your whole life, and no seamstress could ever mend that. By midday the market hum has thinned, but the roads leading out of town are still alive with travelers. You follow a stream of carts clattering toward a wooden bridge arched over a narrow river. The air is sharp with the smell of horses and damp timber. At the far end of the bridge, a booth squats like a spider's den, its keeper perched with quill and ledger. Travelers shuffle forward, purses jingling nervously. This is no simple crossing. Here, tolls, weights, and market tricks could cost more than your coin. They could, in the harshest moments, cost your life. A steady fact anchors the scene. Medieval towns thrived on tolls. Bridges, gates, markets all charged fees. To dodge payment was fraud against the lord or town, and cheating in trade was a crime as serious as theft. If you sold short measures, clipped coins, or manipulated scales, punishment loomed heavy. For ordinary folk, that might mean fines or the stocks. For chronic offenders, it could mean execution, especially when fraud was judged as undermining the realm's stability. After all, coin and measure were the glue of commerce. Crack the glue, and the whole structure wobbled. You picture yourself as a nervous peddler with a sack of apples. The tollkeeper tips your basket, counts aloud, and frowns. Too few for the fee you claim. Was it a mistake, or a scam? The line behind you whispers, and your palms sweat. In this world, even an offhand miscalculation can be recast as deceit. Historians still argue whether executions for cheating markets were widespread or rare, but records tell of merchants hanged for coin clipping, shaving precious silver from currency, and bakers fined into ruin for false weights. There's comedy in the image too. Imagine a customer stomping away from a stall, yelling, "That fishmonger owes me 2 scales," while the fish themselves flap indignantly on the counter. Or a tollkeeper measuring a cartwheel with exaggerated fuss, insisting it is suspiciously rounder than permitted. Medieval justice, for all its severity, had moments that must have looked like theatre to bystanders. Porky Tibbet, in London, traders sometimes had to cry aloud, "It weighs true," when selling goods, turning every purchase into a miniature performance. Some towns even required alewives and butchers to display their official measures publicly, so customers could check. A bit like hanging your measuring cup by the stall, daring anyone to doubt you. But law cut sharp when it wished. Coin clipping especially was seen not just as fraud but as treason against the king's currency. A clipped coin weakened royal authority. And treason, as you've already learned from Forests and Roads, was a charge that swallowed lives quickly. No amount of ladder about apples or fish scales could soften that. You step aside as a wagon rattles past, the driver muttering about tolls too high. Yet he pays, because he must. Behind him, a woman balances a basket of bread, her lips moving in silent prayer that her loaves weigh honestly. You feel the rhythm of survival here, every crossing, every trade, every bargain held under invisible eyes. And you carry away the quiet knowledge, in the Middle Ages, even something as ordinary as a toll booth could be a gate not only between two shores but between safety and peril. The day winds, and you find yourself back near the churchyard, where shadows stretch long and the evening bell tolls once again. But tonight, the silence feels heavier, almost uncanny. A funeral procession passes, villagers carrying a shrouded body toward consecrated ground. You step aside respectfully, though you know that here, even the dead themselves were not beyond the reach of law. In the Middle Ages, corpses, and sometimes even ghosts, could be tried, punished, or exhumed for crimes they had supposedly committed in life or in death. A solid fact to lean on. Ecclesiastical records tell of excommunications pronounced not just on the living, but on the already deceased. Corpses of heretics could be dug up and denied burial in sacred soil. Sometimes bodies were hanged or burned in symbolic justice, long after breath had left them. It was a way of declaring that sin stained not only life but legacy. You imagine the unsettling sight of villagers watching a trial where the accused never raised a hand, because his hands were folded in eternal stillness. Historians still argue whether these cases were acts of genuine belief or the eater meant to instruct the living. Some suggest they were rare spectacles, others that they were surprisingly common tools of control. Either way, you shiver at the idea of death itself offering no escape from law. There are stranger tidbits still. Ghosts were sometimes summoned in stories to stand as witnesses, called by clerics to explain why barns collapsed or fields failed. And animals, too, were buried in disgrace if they had been part of some forbidden act. A medieval mind lived in a world where boundaries blur the living, the dead, the natural, the supernatural, all under the same canopy of law. There's a faint comedy hiding in the horror. Picture a solemn judge scolding a silent corpse for coin clipping, while villagers mutter about the waste of candles. Or imagine a ghost refusing to appear when summoned, leaving clerics awkwardly waiting in an empty room. Justice was serious, but it often tripped on its own robes. You step carefully along the church path, listening to the rustle of leaves overhead. Even in death, a person's story could be rewritten by law. And so, in this world you've walked tonight, where bread, clothes, shoes, fish, words, deer, and even tolls carried moral stakes, you realize the strangest truth of all: the Middle Ages never let go. Not of life, not of death, not of anyone. The candles inside the church flicker low, their light reaching out through cracks in the shutters. You breathe deep, and step away, leaving the dead to their unrest under the watchful eye of laws that once stretched farther than breath itself.